Okay, so it's a bit shorter than usual today. There's an expression that the Torah uses on various occasions. One of those occasions is in this week's parasha. One of those occasions was in last week's parasha, and one of those occasions was in the previous week's parasha. And they all carry the same theme. And that theme is that there's a positive instruction in the Torah to connect to Hashem, or the expression is to cleave to Hashem. V'atem hadveikim v'Hashem elokeichem chayim kulchem hayoim. Those of you who cleave to Hashem, you are alive today. The other expression is uvoi sidbakun, to him you shall cleave. And the other expression is uledov koboy, and to cleave to Hashem. So the question is, what does that mean? What does it mean to cleave to Hashem? We can understand if somebody tells us you need to be dedicated to Hashem, so we can understand what that means. To be dedicated to Hashem, basically, whatever Hashem says, that's what you should do. If somebody would tell us that la'ahava es Hashem, as it says multiple times in the Torah, that you should love Hashem, so we can understand what that means. You love Hashem means you have to engender within yourself a very positive attitude and feeling towards Hashem. Le'yira es Hashem, if the Torah tells us to fear Hashem or to be in awe of Hashem, we have an understanding of what that means. But what does it mean to cleave to Hashem? In fact, it's such a strange concept that the Gemara asks the question, is it possible? Is it possible to cleave to Hashem? And the way that the Gemara frames the question is it says, isn't Hashem eish oichla, an all-consuming fire? Just like a person can't go and embrace a fire, I mean, it wouldn't be a very smart thing to do. So, much more so, you can't cleave to Hashem, because at the end of the day, Hashem is beyond, totally beyond anything that we could relate to. And if anything, Hashem would, so to speak, obliterate us, incinerate us, because He's so overwhelming and His revelation is so powerful. So what does it mean that we should cleave to Hashem? What's interesting about it is that the sages, and Rashi brings it in his commentary, actually give two totally different approaches to the same question. The one approach is, you can't cleave to Hashem. What it means is that you should cleave to those people who themselves are more connected to Hashem than you might be. In other words, that you should have a deep, meaningful connection to what's called Talmidei Chachamim, people who are students of Hashem's wisdom, people who are dedicated to Hashem, people who are the scholars and the pious members of society. If you're connected to them, that will help you to connect to Hashem. And that's quite specific, by the way. It's brought even in the Shulchan Aruch, that what that means is you should try and marry into the family of Torah scholars. You should do business with Torah scholars. You should obviously learn from Torah scholars. Rub shoulders with them as much as you possibly can. That would be an interpretation of to cleave to Hashem. In this week's parasha, though, Rashi gives another explanation, which is also based on the words of our sages. In fact, it comes from the Talmud. And that says, how do you cleave to Hashem? To emulate the way that Hashem behaves. And if you look throughout the Torah, you'll see that there are various things that Hashem does personally throughout the Torah, and that's what we're supposed to emulate. What are the things that we see that Hashem does? So, first of all, as a catch-all, we have a principle that is called Gemilus Chasadim. Gemilus Chasadim means acts of kindness. As opposed to tzedakah you can only do for somebody who is in financial need. Gemilus Chasadim you could do for anybody. You could show kindness to anybody. Doesn't matter if they're wealthy, if they're not wealthy. Doesn't matter if they're successful, unsuccessful. You can show Gemilus Chasadim to anybody. Under that category of Gemilus Chasadim, okay, depending on whose opinion you look at. If you take the Rambam's opinion, it's all under one category. If you take other people's opinions, they are independent mitzvahs. But whichever way you look at it, under the banner of Gemilus Chasadim, there are things like visiting the sick, burying the dead. Those are the two examples that Rashi uses in this week's parasha. The Gemara uses other examples, giving clothing to those who don't have clothing. But Rashi specifically uses these two examples, and he says you have to emulate Hashem in these two ways. And the way that he gets it is because we've already seen much earlier in the Torah that when Avram Avinu had just had his bris and he was in a tremendous amount of pain, so Hashem visited him to fulfill the mitzvah to visit the sick. And we've just recently seen that when Moshe's brother Aaron passed away, so it's left kind of open-ended who buried him. We know the Jewish community did not bury him, because when the Jewish community buries somebody, the Torah tells us, like for example with Miriam, tells us that they buried her. We know that Aaron's son Elazar was not able to bury him because he was the Kohen Gadol, and the Kohen Gadol is not allowed to bury even an immediate member of his own family. And Moshe couldn't bury him because Moshe also had the status in certain respects of a Kohen Gadol, so he also couldn't bury him. So from that we see that Hashem buried Aaron. And that's why Rashi points out these two things. Why? Because to bury somebody, you could say it's a tremendous amount of effort. Let me get somebody else to take care of it. Like there, the Jewish people could have buried Aaron, but Hashem Dafka did it himself. Visiting the sick carries risk, because you go visit the sick, God forbid you could get sick. And you could also say other people could do it, like with Avram. Avram had many people who were very close to him, so Hashem could have said other people could visit them. So how do you cleave to Hashem? By doing goodness for other people when it's difficult or possibly even dangerous to yourself, and you could excuse yourself that other people could do it, but you, Dafka, do it yourself. That's how you cleave to Hashem. That's what Rashi teaches us in this week's parasha. It's a very practical lesson for us. To step outside of our comfort zone, to connect with and to help somebody else is the best way to connect to Hashem. It's a good lesson to keep in mind at all times.